Chosen one, listen carefully. This message isn't an accident. God is preparing something you never saw coming. There are moments in life when you make a decision that seems almost insignificant. You say no, you stop explaining yourself. You walk away from something that has been draining you. You become silent instead of arguing. You choose discipline instead of comfort. You stop chasing someone's approval. And in that moment, you may think, this is just one small decision. But psychologically, spiritually, and philosophically, some of the smallest decisions become turning points because they change the direction of your life. Your last move may have changed more than you realize. Think about how a single decision can alter an entire chain of events. One conversation can change a relationship. One boundary can change how someone treats you. One moment of courage can change your identity. One refusal can protect years of your future. We often judge decisions by what happens immediately afterward, but life rarely works that way. Some decisions produce visible results instantly. Others begin a process that unfolds quietly. That is why you cannot always measure the significance of your last move by what you see today. Maybe you expected an immediate response, but there was silence. Maybe you thought someone would come after you, but they didn't. Maybe you made a choice to leave something behind, and suddenly everything felt uncertain. You may have even questioned yourself. Did I make the right decision? Did I move too quickly? Did I misunderstand what was happening? But here is the deeper question. What if the discomfort you experienced after making that decision was not evidence that you made the wrong move? What if it was evidence that you had finally moved beyond an old version of yourself? Human beings naturally seek psychological certainty. We want confirmation. We want immediate evidence that our decision was correct. But growth rarely gives you that luxury. Growth often requires you to act before the evidence arrives. That is where faith becomes powerful. Faith does not mean pretending you know exactly what will happen next. It means being willing to move forward when you do not know. It means trusting that your value does not depend on another person's reaction, that your future does not depend on your ability to control every outcome, and that sometimes obedience begins where certainty ends. Look at the biblical pattern. Abraham had to leave before he knew the destination. Moses had to move toward the sea before the path opened. Ruth had to step into an unfamiliar future before she could understand what her loyalty would eventually produce. Again and again, the pattern is the same. Movement comes before full explanation, and that may be what your last move represents. Perhaps you finally stopped trying to convince people who had already decided not to understand you. Perhaps you stopped begging for something that required you to abandon your dignity. Perhaps you chose peace over proving your point. Perhaps you decided that your future deserved more attention than your past. That is not weakness. That is transformation. And transformation often creates a strange period where the old life has lost its power, but the new life has not yet become visible. Psychologists might describe this as a transition in identity. Philosophically, it is the uncomfortable space between who you were and who you are becoming. Spiritually, it can feel like a wilderness. But wilderness is not always punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. So don't underestimate the last move you made. It may have been the first visible expression of an internal change that had been developing for months or even years. And perhaps the message that eventually comes, the conversation, opportunity, realization, apology, invitation, or unexpected development, is not what creates the change. It reveals it. Because sometimes the most important message is not the one arriving at your door. It is the message your last decision already sent to the world. I am no longer available for the life I have outgrown. Your next chapter begins when your actions finally agree with the person you are becoming. And now we come to the part that most people misunderstand, the silence that follows a major decision. You make your move, you draw the boundary, you stop chasing, you walk away, you change your priorities, and then nothing happens. No dramatic response, no immediate confirmation, no obvious sign that your decision mattered. Just silence. And that silence can be psychologically uncomfortable because the human mind hates uncertainty. When you don't know what someone is thinking, your mind starts writing the story for them. You begin filling the empty spaces with assumptions. They don't care. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should reach out. Maybe nothing is going to change. And before you realize it, you can undo a decision that took enormous courage simply because you couldn't tolerate the quiet that followed it. But silence does not necessarily mean nothing is happening. Sometimes silence is simply the space between cause and effect. Think about planting a seed. You put it beneath the soil, and for days, nothing appears to happen. If you judged the seed only by what your eyes could see, you would conclude that nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, the seed is breaking open, roots are forming, and a process is underway that cannot yet be seen. Your life can work the same way. There are seasons when the most important changes are invisible. Your character is changing. Your standards are changing. Your emotional dependence is weakening. Your ability to tolerate disrespect is disappearing. Your priorities are becoming clearer. And because these changes happen internally before they become externally visible, you may mistake silence for stagnation. Don't make that mistake. Sometimes the silence after your decision is actually testing whether you meant what you said. It is easy to say you want a different life. It is much harder to behave differently when the old life starts calling you back. This is where discipline becomes more important than emotion. If you decided to stop chasing someone, the real test may not be making that decision. The real test may come 3 days later when you miss them. If you decided to stop explaining yourself, the test may come when someone misunderstands you. If you decided to protect your peace, the test may come when chaos offers you an opportunity to return. Your decision becomes real when you maintain it without receiving immediate validation. And this is where faith teaches something profound. Scripture repeatedly reminds us that visible circumstances do not always reveal invisible reality. There are things being prepared, developed, corrected, and redirected long before they become obvious. That doesn't mean every silence is a supernatural sign, or that every delayed outcome guarantees a particular result. It means you should not automatically interpret silence as rejection. Sometimes silence is simply information you haven't learned how to read yet. Maybe the silence is revealing who truly values your presence. Maybe it is exposing how much of your previous relationship depended on you doing all the emotional work. Maybe it is giving another person time to process your absence. Or perhaps, even more importantly, it is giving you time to discover that you don't need their response to validate your decision. That realization is freedom, because the strongest person in the room is not always the loudest person. Sometimes it is the person who can sit in uncertainty without abandoning their values. You don't have to force the next chapter. You don't have to chase the message. You don't have to manufacture an outcome just because you are uncomfortable with waiting. Let your last move stand. Let time reveal what pressure never could. Because when you stop trying to control every response, you create space to recognize what is actually happening. And sometimes the silence isn't the absence of an answer. Sometimes the silence is preparing you to recognize the answer when it finally arrives. Now consider what happens when the consequences of your last decision finally become visible. It may come through a message, a phone call, an unexpected conversation, an opportunity, an apology, an invitation, or simply a piece of information that suddenly connects the dots. The form may be different, but the psychological experience is often the same. Something that was previously uncertain suddenly becomes clear. And that is why you should pay attention to what your last move set in motion. We tend to think of decisions as isolated events. We make a choice, and then we move on. But human behavior doesn't work in isolated moments. Every decision changes the conditions around us. When you change your behavior, you change what other people experience from you. When you change your boundaries, you change the dynamics of relationships. When you stop pursuing something, you create space for reality to reveal itself without your constant interference. That is powerful. Imagine a person who has spent months trying to convince someone to recognize their value. They send the messages, they explain themselves, they keep initiating conversations, they keep trying to repair something that the other person isn't willing to repair. Then one day, They stop. Not because they hate the person, not because they want revenge. They simply decide, I cannot continue abandoning myself just to maintain this connection. And suddenly, the entire dynamic changes. Maybe the other person reaches out, maybe they don't. But either way, something important has happened. The person has reclaimed their agency. That distinction matters. Your last move does not have to control another person's behavior to be powerful. Its greatest power may be that it changes your behavior, and once you change, the world around you has to respond differently because it is no longer interacting with the same version of you. This is why you should be careful about expecting one specific outcome from an unexpected message. Perhaps you are waiting for someone to apologize. Perhaps you are expecting a particular person to return. Perhaps you believe a certain opportunity is about to appear. But wisdom says, don't become so attached to the form of the answer that you miss the meaning of the lesson. The message might not say what you expected. It might not come from the person you expected. It might not even be a literal message. Sometimes the message is a realization. You suddenly understand why something ended. You recognize why a door stayed closed. You discover information that changes how you see the past. You meet someone who shows you what a healthy relationship actually feels like. You receive an opportunity that makes you grateful for the opportunity you previously lost. Suddenly, what looked like chaos begins to look like a sequence. And that is where faith and psychology meet in a fascinating way. Psychologically, humans are meaning-making creatures. We look backward and connect events into a narrative. Spiritually, faith invites us to believe that our lives can contain purpose even when the purpose is not immediately visible. But don't confuse faith with certainty about specific future events. You don't need to tell yourself, this exact person is definitely coming back, or this exact thing must happen. That can turn faith into expectation and expectation into disappointment. Instead, develop a deeper confidence. Whatever comes next, you will meet it with greater wisdom than you had before. That is real strength. Maybe the message coming into your life will confirm something. Maybe it will challenge something. Maybe it will close a chapter rather than open one. Maybe it will reveal that what you thought you wanted was actually too small for where you are going. So when the unexpected arrives, don't immediately react. Pause, listen, observe. Ask yourself, of my life. Because your emotional reaction is not always your deepest wisdom. You may feel excitement, fear, nostalgia, anger, or temptation, but feelings are signals, not always instructions. Your last move may have created the conditions for a new conversation, but your next response will determine what that conversation means. And perhaps that is the real message, hidden inside everything happening now. You don't need to predict what is coming. You need to become ready for whatever truth arrives. There is another possibility we need to consider, and this one is uncomfortable because it challenges one of our deepest human habits, chasing what we want instead of allowing what is right for us to reveal itself. Sometimes you don't realize the power of your last move until you understand what you stopped doing. You stopped pursuing. You stopped sending the extra message. You stopped explaining why you deserved respect. You stopped trying to force a relationship into existence. You stopped asking someone to give you what they had already demonstrated they were unwilling or unable to give. And at first, that decision can feel like loss. You may feel as though you are giving something up. But sometimes what feels like loss is actually the beginning of emotional freedom. Think about the psychology of pursuit. When we desperately want something, our attention becomes narrow. We begin focusing on one outcome so intensely that we stop seeing alternatives. We convince ourselves that this particular person, opportunity, relationship, or door must open because we have invested so much emotion into it. But investment does not automatically equal destiny. Sometimes you keep knocking because you have been taught that persistence is always virtuous. And persistence is powerful, but only when it is connected to wisdom. There is a difference between perseverance and attachment. Perseverance says, I will continue because this aligns with my values. Attachment says, I must have this because I cannot imagine being okay without it. Those two motivations may look identical from the outside, but internally they are completely different. Your last move may have been the moment you moved from attachment to surrender, and surrender is not giving up. Surrender means releasing your demand to control the outcome. That distinction can change your entire life. When you stop chasing, you create a space in which truth can reveal itself. You no longer have to manipulate circumstances to get the response you want. You no longer have to constantly initiate, persuade, convince, or prove. Now you can observe. Who reaches for you when you stop reaching for them? Who notices your absence? Who respects your boundary? Who only wanted access to you when access was easy? Who comes back with genuine accountability rather than temporary emotion? These questions can reveal more than 100 conversations. And sometimes the shocking message you are waiting for is connected to this exact shift. When your behavior changes, people who were accustomed to the old version of you may suddenly recognize that something is different. But don't misunderstand this. The goal of your growth should never be to make someone chase you. The goal is to become someone who no longer needs to be chased in order to feel valuable. That's the difference between strategy and transformation. If you stop texting someone simply to make them wonder where you are still emotionally controlled by their response. But if you stop texting because you have decided to respect yourself, then your silence is no longer a tactic. It is a boundary, and boundaries have a remarkable psychological effect. They clarify relationships. They show you what people are willing to do when you stop doing everything for them. They reveal whether a connection was mutual or merely convenient. They expose whether someone valued you or simply valued what you provided. And spiritually, this can become an important lesson in trust. You cannot build a meaningful future while constantly trying to force every person and circumstance into the shape you imagined. Sometimes God allows you to release something because you need your hands free for what comes next. The difficult part is that you may not know what comes next. That is where courage enters. You release without guarantees. You walk away without knowing who will replace what you lost. You choose peace without knowing whether someone will return. You trust without demanding a timetable. And then something changes inside you. You realize that your future is not dependent on one person's decision. You realize that rejection cannot erase your worth. You realize that delay does not automatically mean denial. And you realize that sometimes the greatest answer is not getting back what you lost. It is becoming someone who no longer needs to lose themselves to keep it. So if something unexpected returns after your last move, don't rush toward it simply because it is familiar. Look at it carefully. Ask whether it belongs to the person you are becoming, because not everything that comes back is meant to stay. And not everything you once wanted deserves another chance. Your last move was powerful because you stopped chasing an outcome and started choosing your identity. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal, because eventually there comes a moment when you look back at something that once confused you and suddenly see it differently. You realize that what you called rejection may have been protection. What you called delay may have been preparation. What you called an ending may have been the removal of something that could never have accompanied you into the next season of your life. That kind of realization changes you. Most people want clarity before they move. They want to understand the entire plan before taking the first step. But life rarely gives us that kind of certainty. Sometimes you only understand the purpose of a decision after you have lived through its consequences. Think about how often hindsight changes your interpretation of the past. There was something you desperately wanted, and when you didn't get it, you thought your life was falling apart. Months later, you discovered why it couldn't happen. There was someone you wanted to remain close to, and when the relationship changed, you felt abandoned. Later, you recognized patterns you had been too emotionally attached to see. There was an opportunity you thought you had missed, only to discover that another opportunity eventually required you to be available. The event did not necessarily change. Your understanding of the event changed. That is one of the most powerful forms of growth. We often ask, why did this happen to me? But a more mature question is, What is this experience teaching me that I could not have learned any other way? That question moves you from victimhood to responsibility. It doesn't mean every painful event was good. It doesn't mean every disappointment was secretly designed for your benefit. Pain is still pain. Loss is still loss. Some things in life simply hurt, but meaning can be built from what happened, and faith gives that process another dimension. Scripture repeatedly presents people who could not understand the purpose of their circumstances while they were living through them. Joseph could not see the full meaning of his betrayal when it happened. Ruth could not see the entire future when she made her decision to remain faithful. David could not understand every part of his preparation while he was still in the wilderness. The lesson is not that every difficulty guarantees a specific reward. The lesson is that your current perspective is not the whole story. You may be looking at your life through the lens of one chapter while something larger is being written. That is why your last move matters so much. Perhaps you finally closed a door because you recognized that remaining there required you to compromise your values. At the time, it may have felt terrifying. You may have wondered whether you had just destroyed an opportunity. But what if closing that door created the emotional and practical space necessary for another one? Perhaps you stopped responding to manipulation. Perhaps you stopped accepting inconsistent treatment. Perhaps you stopped negotiating with someone who repeatedly violated your boundaries. Perhaps you simply decided that your peace was worth protecting. At first, these choices can feel like endings. Later, they can become explanations. And sometimes the shocking message that arrives is not merely a new opportunity. It is the moment when you finally understand why the old opportunity had to end. Maybe someone tells you something that confirms what you already sensed. Maybe a new opportunity appears. Maybe you receive an apology. Maybe you discover information that changes your understanding of the past. Or maybe nothing dramatic happens at all, and one morning you simply realize, I am no longer angry, I am no longer waiting, I am no longer trying to make sense of what happened. That realization can be the message, because peace is sometimes the confirmation you were looking for. And this is where you must be careful. Don't become so obsessed with signs, timing, or predictions that you miss the transformation happening inside you. The greatest evidence that you are entering a new season may not be something outside you. It may be that you no longer react the way the old version of you would have reacted. You don't need revenge. You don't need everyone to understand. You don't need the person who hurt you to validate your experience. You don't need the past to apologize before you allow yourself to move forward. You can carry the lesson without carrying the burden. So when you look back at your last move, don't only ask whether it produced the outcome you wanted. Ask whether it produced the person you needed to become, because sometimes God doesn't explain the chapter while you're inside it. Sometimes He lets you live long enough to understand it. And one day, what looked like a painful ending may become the very evidence that you were being redirected.